Hello, class. In this video, we're going to work through the solutions to Lab 4.5. The first question says, use the zero product principle to solve the equation. And here's the equation. So what you want to do is think of each of the items in the parentheses as a factor, right? So 8x minus 5 is one factor. 2x plus 7 is another factor. So if we set each factor to 0, we can get the solution to this equation, right? So 8x minus 5, we set it equal to 0, add 5 to both sides, divide both sides by 8, and you're left with x equals 5/8. So 5 over 8 would make this entire equation equal 0, right? The solution to this equation is what value of x would give me 0. So if I were to replace this x with 5 over 8, right, you do 8 times 5 over 8 minus 5, you end up with 0. And that would make this entire thing 0. Now we look at the second factor, and you're trying to figure out what value of x here would make this entire thing 0. So we solve 2x plus 7 equals 0. Subtract 7, divide by 2, and you end up with 7 over 2, negative. So if I were to replace this x with negative 7 over 2, the result would be 0. Right? So again, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to determine the values of x that will result in 0. So there's two different values of x that would result in 0. 5 over 8 would result in 0, and negative 7 over 2 would result in 0. Okay. When I look at problems 2 through 5, notice that the instructions are different here. We have factor, and then on problems 6 through 8, the instructions say solve. See, we can solve equations, right? So this problems 6, 7, and 8 have an equal sign. So we can solve equations with an equal sign, or equations have equal signs. But questions 2 through 5 are expressions. We cannot solve these, so we can only factor, okay, because there's no equal sign. So when I look at my first problem, I factor out a 9, right, because 9 is the smallest number that goes into 18 and 9 evenly. And I also factor out an x squared. Right, we take out the variable with the smallest exponent. So this variable with the smallest exponent is x squared, and the number that goes into the 18 and 9 evenly, the biggest number that goes into 18 and 9 evenly is 9. So if I factor out a 9, meaning I divide each term by 9 and each term by x squared, you're left with 9x squared equals 2x minus 1. All right, so again, we're going to take out a 9 and an x squared, so you see that here. And then if you divide each term by 9x squared, you're left with 2x, right? 18x cubed divided by 9x squared results in 2x. Negative 9x squared divided by 9x squared results in negative 1. Okay, so first you have to determine what we're going to factor out, which would be the 9 and the x squared, and then divide each term by what we factored out. Right, so we factor out 9x squared. We divide each term by 9x squared. Right? Number 3 is a little different than number 2. Right? Notice number 2 only had 2 terms, so this is the method we chose. When we have 3 terms, it's called the trinomial. Often we can factor that into something that looks like this. So what I like to do is I like to ask myself, okay, what 2 numbers when multiplied result in the last term, but when added result in the middle term? So how can I get negative 16? I could say 4 times negative 4 is negative 16. But the problem is if I add 4 and negative 4, I do not get negative 6. But if I look at number negative 8 and negative 2, I'm positive 2. Right? If I multiply negative 8 times 2, that results in negative 16. When I add negative 8 and 2, I get negative 6. So what 2 numbers when multiplied result in the last term? Negative 8 times 2 is negative 16. But when I add those same 2 numbers together, I get the middle term. Negative 8 plus 2 is negative 6. So negative 8 and 2 are my answers. Right? So you're going to say x minus 8, x plus 2. Okay? If you were to use FOIL here, you'd end up right where you started with this x squared minus 6, x minus 16. Take a look at number 4. Same concept. What 2 numbers when multiplied result in the last term? All right, the last term is 21. So negative 7 times negative 3 results in positive 21. Negative 7 plus negative 3 results in negative 10. Right? So again, you're always asking, what two numbers when multiplied result in the last term, but when added result in the middle term? All right, so your answer here would be t minus 7, t minus 3. All right, just like here we did x minus 8, x plus 2. Number 5. Okay, number 5 only has two terms, so we're not going to do what we did here with the trinomials. We're going to try and factor similar to what we did in number 2. Okay, so for number 5, the biggest number that goes into 8 and 32 is 8. And we can't factor out a w because there's only a w in one term. Notice in number 2, there was an x in both terms. Number 5, there's not a w in both terms, so we cannot factor out a w. But we can factor out an 8. So if I take out the 8, or I factor out the 8, divide each term by 8. So 8w squared divided by 8 is w squared. Negative 32 divided by 8 is negative 4. And here you would think you were done, but there's another identity here. This w squared minus 4 is the difference of two perfect squares. So we end up with w plus 2, w minus 2. And just to refresh your memory, right, the rule here is this a squared minus b squared equals a minus b, a plus b. Right, that's the difference of two squares. Right, w squared minus 4, 2 squares. So you took the square root of 4 to get 2, and it's plus or minus the 2. Here we take the square root of a squared, which is plus or minus a. The square root of b squared, which would be the plus or minus the b. And then if you look at it, let's say we had x squared minus 100. Well, what's the square root of 100? It's 10. Right, so this is really saying x minus 10, x plus 10. Right? Or you could think of this as x squared minus 100 is the same as x squared minus 10 squared, and then we can kind of follow the same identity up here. Right? X minus 10, x plus 10. Right? If you look at 81, that's going to be 9 and negative 9. 25 is 5 and negative 5. This is the one people forget, the x squared minus 1. People forget that the square root of 1 is 1. Right? So x squared minus 1 is still the same as x squared minus 1 squared, which is x minus 1, x plus 1. So that's how we end up with 8 times the quantity w plus 2, w minus 2. So again, for all of these problems, it said factor. There is no equal sign. So we could only reduce. We couldn't solve. Numbers 6, 7, and 8 are very similar, except now there's an equal sign. So my suggestion here would be to factor the left side of the equal sign, similar to what you did for problems 2 through 5. And then after you factor to solve, well, here you're saying, all right, what value of x would result in 0? Well, if I put in a negative 7 here, negative 7 plus 7 would give me 0. So x equals negative 7 is the answer. And if I put a positive 6 here, 6 minus 6 equals 0, so positive 6 is an answer, right? So you have to go a step further with problems 6, 7, and 8 compared to 2 through 5, right? With problem 4 or 3, we stop here because it's not equal to 0, but problem 6, 7, 8, since it's equal to 0, we have to go a step further, similar to what we did with question 1, right? What value of x gives me 0? What value of x gives me 0? And that's what we did for 6, 7, and 8. So I'll leave that up for a moment. Okay. Right, so 6 is good. 7, we had to do a little bit of work. Notice how this is trinomial equals 0. Here we don't have a trinomial yet. So if I bring the 5x over and the negative 4 over, it's going to be equal 0 on the right side, and then we can begin. Okay. Number 3. I first factor out a 3, and then we're left with that difference of 2 squares to get k minus 1, k plus 1. Okay. Number 9. Okay, so we know this opens up because the value of a is plus 1, right? The value in front of the x squared. Since it's positive, we know the parabola opens up. Question 9b, use a formula. Well, this is the axis of symmetry is x equals negative b over 2a. So going back, my a was positive 1, my b was 8. So that's going to be negative 8 over 2 times 1, which results in negative 4. So the axis of symmetry, the equation is negative 4 To get the vertex, remember, we take the -4 and sub it into the original equation, which looks like this. All right, so -4 squared plus 8 times -4 plus 15, and we end up with -1. So 4 comma -1 is my solution. The y-intercept is really just the c value, the 15, but you could always sub in 0 for x, and you end up with 15. Right? The x-intercept is a little trickier. I'm going to do that on another video. Okay, so stay tuned for the next video.